Dear students, welcome to the class of International Politics. And today in this session, I will try to summarize the main points in Chapter 4, Human Rights in International Politics. And before we start, let's have a look at the learning outcomes. After completing this chapter, you will be able to express the current philosophical discussions of human rights, report the historical background of human rights, explain the internalization process of human rights, and finally, you will be able to discuss the relationship between international relations theories and human rights. Actually, it's a good starting point to question what the concept of right itself means and whether it's possible to have a common definition of a right on all humanity, the sources of rights, the classification of rights, and to what extent rights are universal are important questions to be discussed in human rights theory. And let's start with the source of rights. What is the source of rights is an important question that must be discussed in the literature of law. Actually, it has been discussed in the literature from past to present, and in this context, it is often argued that a source of rights is the law of nature. However, some other people, and we can say that they are the advocates of positive law, and they claim that human beings, rather than natural law, create rights. And now let's look at the classification of rights, and we can say that rights are classified as negative status rights, positive status rights, and active status rights. And negative status rights emphasize the restrictions of states and personal immunity. Positive status rights emphasize the need for states to take on various responsibilities to strengthen social and economic conditions. And active status rights include both the guarantee and the extension of the rights to vote and to be elected. And in other words, we can say that active status rights are the rights that enable political participation. And another important point to be emphasized about human rights is the consideration that the development of human rights is largely Western-centric. In this context, a broad literature has been established that discusses the extent to which Islam and Far East Asian values may be compatible with universal human rights. Lastly, it's possible to mention the existence of a large literature on the causes of human rights violations, the type of the political system, the economic structure of the country, poverty, other ideologies of hatred and psychopathological characters, and the lack of sovereignty of the states are used to understand human rights violations. Now, let's look at the historical background of human rights. Human rights have been expressed in various circles from ancient Greece to Rome and from institutional belief systems to non-institutional belief systems. However, human rights gain its present meaning throughout the modern times. It's the result of a nearly 3 centuries of struggle that started with the English Revolution and continued with the American and French revolutions. And revolutionary developments towards fundamental rights occurred in England in the 17th century, and in this period, the existence of some untouchable rights was vigorously spoken, and these fundamental rights were defended against the authorities of that time. And now let's look at the 18th century. And here in the 18th century, dubbed as the Age of Revolutions by Freeman, political rights were increasingly rooted in American and French revolutions. And in this period, the idea that people have a number of natural rights they possess at their birth is a product of this period, and this idea strikes a mark on human rights doctrine. Actually, here in this context, it is also important to mention certain names, and John Locke is one of them. He has an undeniable value in terms of liberal human rights, and John Locke claims that people have inherent natural rights they acquire at their birth. These fundamental rights, which are also the core of current liberal doctrine, are life, liberty, and property. And if you look at the developments in the 19th century, we should talk about the liberal and socialist tendencies that gained momentum in Europe with the 1830 and 1848 revolutions, erupted with the Industrial Revolution, and they have become important cornerstone events in obtaining fundamental rights, in particular political rights. And let's look at the internalization process of human rights. The internalization of human rights is the result of a long period of time. In this context, the first transnational attempts are some regulations concerning the law of war. The Hague Conventions and the Geneva Protocol should be mentioned here. And undoubtedly, all these arrangements served as an important cornerstone in the formation of the law of war. And in addition to all these, for the first time in the Congress of Vienna of 1815, regulations were made to forbid trade of slaves, and similarly the Slavery Convention of 1926, and afterwards the League of Nations had strictly forbidden the trade of slaves and slavery itself. Now, let's look at the post-Cold War developments in the process of the internalization of human rights. The mention and appreciation of human rights in international texts are largely followed by post-1945 era. In this context, a move that needs to be underlined has been the Helsinki Final Act, and it includes regulations about human rights. Actually, the period in which human rights were emphasized much more in international politics was after the Cold War, and the tension between sovereignty and the principle of non-intervention has become more visible in this period. And in addition to this, international organizations have increased their sensitivity towards human rights, and the civil society organizations operating at the sub-state level have played an active role both in their own countries and in transnational geographies. With globalization, international organizations as well as transnational organizations have become increasingly visible. It can be argued that policies of international organizations have played an important role in transforming the principle of absolute sovereignty in the face of human rights. And in this context, numerous organizations have introduced the principle of conditionality for the protection of human rights could be mentioned. For example, the European Union. Actually, European Union effectively implements this principle in the process of membership while encouraging candidate members to take steps in line with democratization and human rights. And secondly, the transformation of sovereignty has become possible not only by the hands of states, but also by the increasing activities of non-state actors from above to below. In this context, in globalization human rights relations, and here it is called the globalization from below, I should draw your attention to the formation of global civil society. And from now on, my focus will be on the international organizations, and they are really significant in world politics, and they act on the purpose of the protection of human rights. And for the most important, one of the most important international organizations is the United Nations. And United Nations aim to protect world peace and security, develop a friendly relationship among states, and promote cooperation in the international arena. Indeed, the main reason to start with the United Nations as a significant international organization for the issue of human rights is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As it's evident from its name, the Declaration ensures the protection of human rights universally. In other words, it includes common principles to be achieved universally by the humanity. And another international organization that should be mentioned is the Council of Europe, and it aims to provide justice and international cooperation in terms of a closer unity, to promote democracy through the protection of individual freedom, political liberty, and the rule of law, and to facilitate economic and social progress of its member states. And we should also talk about some non-governmental organizations here. And let's look at the definition of non-governmental organizations. Actually, they are units of people who came together voluntarily toward a specified objective without a citizenship restriction, which means that non-governmental organizations members do not belong to a particular country, and people can participate in non-governmental organizations from anywhere in the world. Because non-governmental organizations could be organized over the world without being based on a specific country, they have become effective tools to create awareness on specific issues and informing political authorities. Some of these organizations acting on the purposes of human rights issues are Amnesty International, Freedom House, and Human Rights Watch. Now, let's look at the theory of international relations and human rights. Here, it is possible to talk about four diverse theories approaching the relation of international relations and human rights, and they are normative theory, liberalism, constructivism, and English school. Normative theory advocates a global order in which respect for human rights becomes a norm, and they also focus on the existence of human rights as a moral necessity. Liberalism questions the possibilities of cooperation in international relations, and they claim that, or they focus on international institutions and international regimes that are capable of protecting human rights. As for constructivism, we can say that constructivism emphasizes that the norms for protecting human rights are getting stronger. So the keyword here is the norms. And lastly, English school, and they emphasize justice and order, and they say that they are significant concepts, and they also draw attention to the rule that international community provides consensus. Dear students, so far in this chapter we have talked about human rights, and we have looked at a philosophical and conceptual framework. We also talked about historical background of human rights. Then we talked about the internalization process of human rights. And finally, we talked about the theory of international relations and human rights. That's all for today. See you next chapter.